and those in the audience. To introduce myself, or first of all, welcome to today's dialogue on diversity. It's titled Stay or Go, the story of a Gandhi sculpture. My name is John Bossenbrook. I'm a professor and chair in the Department of Environmental Sciences. I'm also the chair of the President's Commission on Campus Design and the Environment. This committee was formed a little over a year ago, I believe. And it took over some of the responsibilities, or all the responsibilities, of the former beautification committee. There was also used to be a river commission, and some of those responsibilities got folded into this as well. So first day, I'd like to give a little history about how we got to where we are today, and then I'll introduce a few things we hope to discuss and have the panel introduce themselves. So how did we get here? Well, one of the commission's tasks is to organize an annual sculpture exhibit. So hopefully most of you have been on our campus and wandered around and see these. We usually have 7 or 8 on the main campus, 1 over on the health science campus, 1 on engineering. This event is organized through an organization called the Midwest Sculpture Initiative. What they do is they supply us with a list, or a host of pictures of potential pieces. Some year, the first year I did this, there was over 100 pieces we sorted through. This year, because we were doing it online, they limited our selection to like 45 or so. But the committee looks through those and selects 10 sculptures to display on our campus. The commission is made up of faculty, administrators, people in grounds and facilities, campus architect, and so none of us are actually artists. So one of the things we look for is diversity in pieces in terms of style and what they're made of, kind of a feel for us. And this year, one of those sculptures, which we selected back in April, was a sculpture of Mahatma Gandhi. There's a lot of reasons for this. Obviously, Gandhi's message of peace was not lost to us. But also, this was, I think, for some of the committee members who've been doing this process for a long time, this was one of the first opportunities to have a highly realistic bronze sculpture. We've had other bronzes, but this one is a highly realistic one. I think if I can, what I'll do here a second is share. Nope, I don't believe I can share my screen in the post right now. So if we get to that point, we can do that, or maybe I can email it to the host here a second. Maybe I'll do that when people are introducing themselves, so that that people can see the piece before we move on. So the sculptures were brought to campus in the middle of June, and a couple weeks later, I received an email bringing up concerns about some of the past statements and writings of Gandhi that include statements that can be seen as racist and misogynistic. It was not just this email. One email I heard through the grapevine that there were multiple students that had similar concerns. And at that time, right, this was the beginning of July when I got that email. We were a month past the death of George Floyd, and every day there was monuments and statues and sculptures being removed across the country. I think in the scope of the 2 months of June and July, over 100 monuments across our country had been taken down. And so based on these concerns, I talked with the commission. I talked with, and one of those members is Diane Miller, who is the chief of staff to the president. So again, this is the president's commission, so any big decision should come through that office. With that, we talked to other members of the administration, including Willie McGrether, who is the head of our diversity and inclusion. And through those conversations, Diane and Willie talked to the president, and the president ultimately decided that we should remove that sculpture. And to back up, I guess I think everybody's first instinct was, we're an academic institution, so let's use this as a teaching tool and talk about it. But there was a lot of questions, right? There was a whole lot of issues going in our country, still now, and at that time. Also, this was not our, we did not own this piece, and this piece was probably also the most expensive piece we ever leased on campus. And so I think some of that had to go into that decision making. But ultimately, the president decided to pull the sculpture, and given that, we still wanted to have this conversation. So, was this the right way to respond? What went into that response? And that's this dialogue today is supposed to represent, the beginning of that conversation. And so, with that, kind of the range of issues that I hope we cover today are, what is the role of sculptures on a campus? Is it different from art in general? How does that differ between monuments, right? A lot of the things that are being taken down across the country are monuments. Um, Obviously Gandhi is known for some great achievements. How do we discuss and think about those achievements of people that are fallible, and then finally to reflect on the response of the Toledo community over the summer, and then moving forward. So with that, again, thank you all for being here, and I'd like to go ahead and let the panel introduce themselves, and go ahead and do that in alphabetical order. And while you're doing that, I will mute myself and send an email of the image over to the host so that the participants can see the sculpture. So Riley, please start.
Hi, well, my name is Riley Danford. I am the person who sent the initial email to Brosenbrook that he was explaining. And I am a senior in sorry, I'm like losing my train of thought. I'm senior year in the College of Business. I'm a human resources major. And I don't know, I just kind of saw, I walk around campus a lot. I live right near campus, and I kind of just saw this statue just around with me and my friend who's actually in attendance right now. And her and I just kind of talked about it, and I just, she was actually the one that encouraged me to email him anyways. Yeah, that's the statue. But thank you.
Thank you, Riley. I think I'm up next if we're going alphabetically. So I am Dr. Rachel Dudley, an assistant professor in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies. And my research interests have to do with medical history and slavery, particularly the use of enslaved women as experimental subjects in the development of modern gynecology. And particularly the women that were associated with the life and legacy of Dr. James Marion Sims, who has been widely referred to as the quote unquote father of modern gynecology. And so there have been a lot of caught up in some of the context that Jonathan was just talking about, of these sweeps and conversations about what to do with some of these controversial figures who have been memorialized in statues and monuments. And so just in 2019, there was the removal of the Sims statue and replacement with one dedicated to the legacies of the enslaved women known by their first names, Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy. So I'm here and interested in sort of the memorial culture aspects of this story, the complexities of the story, and I want to be careful not to create false equivalencies as well between figures like Gandhi and figures like say J. Marion Sims or Columbus, et cetera. So very excited to be here and to see what kinds of threads come up in the conversation.
Mysoon?
I wasn't sure which of these panelists are part of the panel or not. They're listed as panelists. But anyway, my name is Maysoon Rizk. I'm a professor of art history in the Department of Art. And a lot of my scholarship has dealt with an artist who was frequently censored both during his lifetime and after his death. So I'm particularly sensitive to issues of censorship, especially when it happens in a way that curtails an opportunity for discussion to take place, or even for familiarity with the issues to be allowed to unfold. But I'm also interested in talking about some of the issues that John raised in terms of the difference between monuments and art, and what role this Gandhi sculpture might play. So thank you for inviting me to be part of this.
Dale?
Hello, everyone. I'm Dale Snowart, a professor of philosophy of education and peace studies at the university in the College of Education, the director of my undergraduate minor in peace and justice studies. And I teach in that I teach a course in nonviolence and conflict transformation, which is in part based on Gandhian philosophy and principles, also as developed over time in the civil rights movement and other movements. So I'm very interested in this topic and this important conversation. My research has to do with the interface between moral and political philosophy and educational theory, in particular the moral and political foundations of democratic education and peace education. So, thank you.
Sanat?
Hello, yes, my name is Sanat. I'm a student here at the College of Business and Innovation. I'm a junior majoring in finance. As an Indian, I was first introduced to Gandhi as a middle school kid in my textbooks. And over the years, I've had a chance to learn about him, learn about his journey as an individual who freed India from the rulers of British. And I've also had a chance to learn about his early years, around which the controversies prevailed. So I'm really excited for this conversation, and thank you for having me on the panel.
Great, thank you, everybody. So I think the way I'm going to move this is more from a broader perspective, and then narrow in onto the specifics of what happened here on campus. And so I'd like to start with this conversation that Maysoon alluded to open up this discussion about, what do you see as, for this panel, as the role of a sculpture exhibit such as the one we hold on campus? Does it differ from the role of art in general? Does it differ from the role of monuments? How do we define those things? What is the role of these different parts of visual art? I guess, Maysoon, I'm going to ask you to kick things off on this piece.
I'm happy to do that. I'll say one thing first, which might help provide a launch pad for some other responses, which is that in general, monuments actually represent some degree of power and are meant to embody some particular ideology. I don't think of this particular sculpture as a monument. It was created by an individual. It wasn't commissioned by a larger entity like a national country or an organization. But I could see how raising a monument to Gandhi could also play into that idea of power relations, especially from the perspective of people who might be considering his early attitudes about people of color and women. In terms of art on campus, I mean, I guess that's a more complicated and maybe slightly different direction of the conversation. So maybe I'll leave that alone for now and wait to hear what other people have to say. Is that okay, John?
It's great. Yeah. Others want to chime in on, you know, what these kind of pieces on campus mean, how you see them in relation to, you know, again, most of the things that are being removed across campus, and that's thank you, Baisoon, for putting that power piece into it. That's a nice way to reflect on that. But other thoughts?
I kind of just think, you know, as a student, I've lived here my entire life. Like my whole family has gone to Toledo. Like my mom, my dad, my stepdad, like my uncles, you know, like this is like, you know, my home basically. Like I was born, I was and raised here. This is where I wanted to go, you know. And I just kind of felt, you know, like I said earlier, was that, you know, I just kind of wanted to share my thoughts on it. And I kind of wanted people to know about it because like I said in our other meeting that some people weren't involved in, but I didn't know about it at the time either. And so I thought it would be, you know, good to share. And like I said, this is my home. I didn't want anyone to take offense to this statue, monument, or, you know, piece of art or whatever you want to call it at the moment. But I kind of think very, very personally, I think it is a little like odd to have maybe like a sculpture of anybody on campus. I've never seen one on campus, and I've been a lot of places on campus, and I've been here. I've been on campus for more than just my career as a student, and it was a little odd at first. Let alone the fact that it was Gandhi, who's becoming a little controversial at the time. I don't know. I just kind of thought, you know, that I should say something as a student, as somebody who lives here, and share that piece that, you know, I do think that art is freedom of speech and that it is valuable in and of its own thing. But I kind of agree. Well, my student kind of touched on it where she said that it is a little controversial being like on a campus. There's a lot of other opinions. There's a lot of people there. And I just wanted to maintain that UT was neutral, whether the statue was removed, whether it was moved, whether it was whatever. I just didn't really think that it had a place on campus with such a negative beginning. That was just kind of my thing on like the fact that it was like the statue.
Thank you for sharing that, Riley. If I might jump in here too. Riley's not alone, obviously, in these concerns. As I was getting educated, honestly, Riley, you forced me to do my own research. As I was getting educated on some of the controversial aspects of Gandhi's biography, I realized that there's actually a relatively widespread pushback that I was unaware of, including the removal of a statue at the University of Ghana in 2018, and some controversies also. California, I think Fresno University as well. They were having similar dialogue. So you're putting us on trend, Riley, with raising these concerns. I would say in terms of the role of sculpture and in exhibits on campus, I love our campus. I think it's beautiful and we're highly ranked for the beauty. And a part of that beauty is the ability to walk around or roll around campus and to see art and sculpture and these depictions. But I think what Riley raises there and what the question raises is the difference then between a sort of highly realistic bronze sculpture of an individual and sort of more abstract kind of artistic representations. At the level of the individual, I love what Maisoon said about power and even ideology. And it sort of reflects back our values, cultural values. From a feminist sort of women's and gender studies perspective as well, what we tend to see at for individual sculptures or dedications is in most cases, given patriarchal context of our world, these tend to be great men. People who are considered great men. And so though that's part of the power, the power arrangements of culture and the idea of sort of these negotiations that take place around meaning making, particularly for individuals that are highly realistic and lifelike. So those are just my sort of preliminary thoughts there.
If I don't know if you want to add to any of this, Dale, but before you do, I just want to also point out about this particular sculpture that it's not a representation of a young man, Gandhi as a young man. It's a representation of a very old Gandhi. And for that reason, if we are going to approach the sculpture from the perspective of its realism, then in a way, whatever significance we might attribute to it or symbolism, I feel like we have to tackle that aspect of it that it's an older man, not a young man. So in a way, to conflate this representation of Gandhi with comments he made when he was a much younger man, to me is a little bit problematic. But I'm going to jump back out and see what
Well, nobody else is saying anything. But I kind of don't agree with that. I remember Dale last meeting. I don't like to bring up old stuff that because other people don't really know about. But he said last meeting that he wants to look at the person as a whole, as in like a positive standpoint. And I do agree with that. Like you should look at the person as a whole, but more like from a neutral standpoint, if that makes sense. Because like the things were still said. If he ever did bad things, then the bad things were done. Like, just because he's an old person, like, you could erect a statue of, of anybody and maybe they were like, but my point is that like, and, an abuser is an abuser, whether the words were abusive or what he said was abusive, those kind of feelings don't go away just because he's old. If somebody in your lifetime, like was a bully, you're going to remember that for your whole life. You're not going to remember, like, you're not going to be like, well, like just because he's 30 now, so he's not like my middle school bully anymore. I mean, like he kind of is, if that had a very big impact on you, if that kind of makes sense. Like that, just because he's old, the feelings are still there.
I'm not saying that just because he's old, we should forgive him for these things. I'm saying that this is an individual who evolved in his thinking, and the particular state that he's being represented in that sculpture was not as this younger, unevolved person. It's true that we should be looking at the whole, but at the same time, we're not talking about an individual who stayed with those same attitudes that I think you're disagreeing with. But.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, is the opportunities for evolution over the span of a life, evolution of thinking, and also of redemption, for folks who have recognized the errors in their thinking. I wish we had a Gandhi scholar with us that could talk about how his thinking evolved, but we know that it did. But I think we also should speak with specificity about exactly what was said and done. So I don't know if we want to do that now or later, but I think that requires some contextualization as well.
I'd like to hear what Dale has to say about Gandhi.
Yes, these are important considerations, and I appreciate the complexity of the conversation. It is the historical record of Gandhi's early years is clear that he made racist and sexist statements, actions. We have to consider the young Gandhi in the context in which he was immersed. And that context was both culturally from the caste system in India and also within the context of the British Empire and British imperialism, that a very strong influence of social hierarchy was at play in his environment. And so it would be kind of surprising that someone wouldn't adopt a perspective of social hierarchy given those contexts. And he himself, as a person of color from the British point of view, was a victim of racism. But in that system, as a young man, he was also a perpetrator, perhaps, of racial attitudes. But we have to, I think, to begin with, ground this conversation in the beginning in the prevalence of social hierarchy in his environment, and both patriarchal and racist. The encouraging thing about Gandhi is that he didn't spend his whole life in that position. That the great message of Gandhi is about transformation. And through critical self-examination, exposure, and experience to other people, he underwent a profound shift in his identity and his consciousness, really a shift to the recognition and affirmation of global solidarity with the exploited masses of the earth. And became a champion, really, of resistance to injustice, domination, oppression for all people, especially those who suffered under exploitation and oppression, and developed out of that a duty to resist injustice as his driving force. I think this illustrates a basic principle of Gandhi, that change is possible, that transformation is possible, that even if we start at a critical examination of self and society, we can appeal to our better angels, and we can transform ourselves internally. And the genius of Gandhi and his world historic achievement was, I believe, to operationalize this principle that change is possible, that self-transformation is possible. He operationalized that politically in terms of nonviolent direct action, able to and directed at the not only changing individual attitudes, but changing the nature of society in the direction of greater justice and peace. And the essence of nonviolent direct action is to awaken the conscience, expand the consciousness of the people, so that they can come to a different point of view, that they can be transformed and begin to become aware of the injustice that has been taken for granted. And that's the essence of nonviolent movements, including the civil rights movement and the heir to the civil rights movement, the Black Lives Matter movement. It's an attempt to awaken the moral conscience of the people. And that's premised upon the possibility of self-transformation and social transformation. So when I look at Gandhi, I believe this is the legacy of Gandhi, that even if we're morally fallible, even if we are flawed, change is possible, transformation is possible, both individually and socially. And that possibility of change is really at the heart of the process of education, especially from a liberal education point of view, that growth is possible. We believe educationally that our students can grow, that they can be changed, that they can be transformed, and they're transformed through dialogue, through critical examination of themselves and their society, through inquiry and dialogue. So when I view Gandhi's legacy in that way, that even though flawed and fallible, he stood for change and the possibility of change. I find inspiration in that legacy, and that's the legacy I think we want to promote, and not promote, but take seriously. So those are my basic thoughts about how to think about Gandhi, at least how I think about Gandhi. He resisted this whole idea that he was a saint, and in fact that he didn't like Mahatma. He was a human being, but believed in the possibility of change and transformation, and that's the legacy I'd like to honor with Gandhi.
Thanks, Gail. I think you ended that talking a lot about the transformation, and Rachel asked a good question about how detailed do we need to talk about his transgressions, right? You know, what did he actually say that he transformed from? Is, you know, how important is it to talk about those things as opposed to the you know, the evolved self? Because obviously those specific statements that he said are what struck the chord.
Well, yes, I think we should strive for intellectual honesty, and see Gandhi for who he was, both in terms of his flaws, but also in terms of his development as a person and what he ultimately stood for. So it's important to understand the full picture.
Yeah, I really appreciate that perspective, Dale, so much. The specificity, though, is important for me because it wasn't just generically racist statements. They were specifically anti-Black statements. And what that really has forced me to think about is the global nature, really, and the long-standing nature of these kind of anti-Black racism, specifically anti-Black racism, and then what our sociologist colleagues might call those horizontal sort of hostilities, which are about sort of hierarchies and rankings between marginalized communities. And I really appreciated your context, Dale, there of sort of Gandhi's statements kind of reflecting, in some senses, his situatedness in these British imperial contexts, right? And kind of reminded me, when you read the statements, actually, it reminds me of a sort of imperialist sort of travel writing, particularly white male imperialist sort of travel writing, where they would have the luxury of going to these different places and then would talk about the indigenous quote unquote savages, or these particularly of virulent anti-Black language. So I do want to pause on that just to be clear, especially because the nature of our dialogues come out of this particular moment that we're in with Black Lives Matter that Dale mentioned, and also particularly with Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. So I want to pause on that. And the particularly patriarchal mentality, frankly, of that were sort of misogynistic statements as well. So we get that, as you said, in terms of intellectual honesty, but that we also are nuanced enough to appreciate the evolution of those views.
Well said. Very well said.
So yeah, we've kind of flown through most of my the things I wanted to touch on, just in a very fluid manner, which has been great. But we haven't had a chance to hear from Sanat really. So can you give me some of your thoughts about what you've
Yeah.
thought since I invited you to this panel and what you've been hearing today?
Yes, I think transformation is something that we must really consider when speaking about Gandhi. And I also want to touch on something uh, Rachel said about his specific comments around the Black community. It is important to note that these comments were made when in a time when the South Africa was ruled by predominantly white British. And these comments were somehow made to woo the British government and get something in return from them. Um, I'm not sure if I'm in a liberty to say what those comments were, but if we really look at those comments, they were kind of a sarcastic comment towards the British government in a way to tell them the reality of that time surrounding the Black community in Africa and mostly South Africa. So it was really uh, hardlining, sarcastic comments towards the British government. And it is also important to see that these comments were recorded by a British journalist. Very often, even in today, we see that some politician or a celebrity makes a comment and then they have to come out after a time saying that they were taken out of the context by the media. So it is often believed that this is a similar situation where he was trying to say something else and he was taken out of context. A very infamous policy of the British rulers at that time was divide and rule. And it is also believed, to the best of my knowledge, I don't want to say anything else, but to the best of my knowledge, it is believed that the part of journalism was a part of that divide and rule policy. And they were kind of seeing this revolutionary young man, Gandhi, rising in South Africa to support the uh, races of colors and lead a kind of a rebellion against the British government. So they tried their best to kind of create any gap and any division that they can create during that time. I hope that offers some perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Sanat. I think so. I mean, there's been two areas of his comments that have reached criticism. The racist comments of when he was a lawyer in South Africa, and I think we've addressed those here. At least put him in context, right? He was a lawyer, trained in England, moved to South Africa, was in a time of apartheid in that system. But we haven't touched about any kind of the misogyny that he's been accused of kind of the purity culture. Again, I'm an environmental scientist, so I'm way out of my little my lane in terms of expertise. But obviously preparing for this, I tried to do a lot of reading, and there does seem to be some contradictory issues of Gandhi's writing about kind of the purity culture in even when he was older in India himself, testing his purity with younger women. So again, I'm not a historian, but I think we've got a good context for his racist statements and where he was there. Does anybody have any reflection on kind of the longer lived, it seemed, or at least later in life, kind of misogynistic behavior or thoughts about sexual purity? Anybody done any more investigation or have more experience in that realm?
Well, I just wanted to say real quick, Gandhi was not quoted by a British journalist. He was recorded by an Indian journalist named Rishanda Gua, and that's been every publication that I've read. He was recorded by his followers who were Indian. There was a movie made on it that I did not see, and that was made by a British journalist years later based on those things, but he was not initially recorded by some publicist who twisted what he said. These were his loyal followers, And, you know, I think sarcastic or not, it's, you know, it's pretty inappropriate to say something, I think, that negative about other people, you know, whether he meant it as a joke or not. You know, there are racist jokes out there, and I don't, you know, I don't find any of them funny. So that's just my thing.
Yeah, I meant sarcasm not as a joke, but as in to reflect on the hardline reality, because the things that he described, the words that he used to describe the living conditions of that community at that time, the words that he used were actually the reality, and they were a reality because that reality was forced on those communities by the British rule. Um, and as far as that writing goes, Mrs. Guha, I think she's more of a modern journalist who explored those statements in some records which were created by the British journalist at that time. I might be wrong, so I apologize if that was wrong information, but that's something I just got on Google, that it was in the records by the British journalist, which were later found by the Indian journalists.
I think what I hear you sort of saying, both of you in a sense, is that this is a reflection of, and this was Dale's point too earlier, this is a reflection of Gandhi internalizing sort of those sort of British colonial attitudes. Is that what I'm hearing?
In a way, yes, because I think during his early years, he was born in a society which was poor, which was power, which was suffering social injustice. And in that time, he was kind of brought up in an environment where he learned to woo the British, to conform to the British practices. He grew up and then he traveled to England where he got his education and became a lawyer. He traveled to South Africa to practice law. So he never really opposed the British rules or the practices in his early years, but rather conformed to those practices. And I guess as he grew older, as he became more aware, that's when we see the real transition in Gandhi from that British American lawyer, British Indian lawyer, to the rebel who led the freedom against British.
Okay. I'm trying to think about that. I'm happy to be quiet as we're reflecting and let others jump into. I'm trying to think about that because what it is interesting to me is when we exist in these contexts of domination, in this specific case or you know, larger conversations, when we exist in contexts of domination, we're all in a sense internalizing those oppressive scripts and mentalities. Does that mean that we are forgiven in those moments where we reflect that? And I'm also thinking too about, you know, progressive leaders. I'm thinking of Black civil rights progressive leaders, or even, you know, progressive leaders today who are, for example, you know, extremely progressive and forward thinking along the lines of race, but, you know, notoriously sexist or transphobic or homophobic. And so I'm trying to just sort of grapple with all of that, and also continuing always to remember that this is not, as so many of us have pointed out, this is not a static story. This is not, you know, we don't exist as static moments in time, but that we are allowed evolution and hopefully redemption and grace as well. But thank you for sharing that.
So I think, you know, one of the last things I want the panel to talk about is kind of the response of the university. But before we do that, I mean, we do have some attendees. We've been talking a long time, and I think there might be some and we've talked before, so I'm hoping we're not talking past the people that are in attendance. So I want to give 15, 20 minutes of time for some more dialogue with the attendees. What questions do they have? Some clarifications, and then let's go back and kind of revisit, go back to the actual sculpture and think about how we got to here today, and how do we do things better in a better way in the future. So are there comments or questions from the audience? We're all processing. All right, well, I guess not. So
Actually, I think that somebody in the audience just messaged me and said that their mic is turned off by the host.
okay, can they
So
set
they can't even talk.
Can they put the chat? Can they put their question in the chat, maybe?
Yeah.
While we figure it out?
I don't even know how they would have gotten muted.
Thank you. Mysoon says, type your questions here.
So I know people in the audience can, at least they can message me privately, because one person did. So, but that was just about something else. So, well, if we can keep talking. We're obviously not having any problems there. Let's see. I guess, yeah. Oh, go ahead. Or,
Jonathan, can you clarify what so the President's Commission decided to not to install the statue, right? Did we
no, it
already,
was installed.
so it's decided to remove it, right?
Yeah, so it was up for about a month.
Okay, so has the question been resolved yet about whether or not it will potentially be reinstalled, or is that a done deal?
No, I mean, I think that's what part of tonight is. I mean, whether it won't be free to, so there's always economics in the equation. It costs money for people to come and bring in, and most of the funding for these sculptures is we have foundation accounts. That's what funds the art exhibit. So there's, and so the removal and putting it back would pay for that. Which is fine. I think if it's a decision across campus that this was something we should be brought back, we'll find a way to cover that. But no, that's, there's been no decision about whether it would be brought back. We could bring it back as part of next year's exhibit. No decision about where the next step in terms of the sculpture.
Okay. Got it.
We did have some comments. So Elizabeth said, had Gandhi responded to these allegations when he was alive? And then another person, Caitlin, said, while I understand that he evolved as a human being, his writings and earlier teachings left a lingering damage in present-day India that needs to be considered, as this damage has currently affected women throughout the country. Elizabeth, I do not know if he responded to these allegations, because in the way that I understood that they were recorded more as in, like, not that, oh, he's saying something negative, let me write this down, this is, offensive. More just like they were his followers, they viewed him very highly, so they wrote down everything that he said. So it was more recorded in like a very neutral sense, more just like, this is something that he said. But they also did that kind of with everything. And then people found these writings and then wrote books about it. And that's where Mr. Gua, who I mentioned earlier, came in, where he was the one that kind of wrote a very neutral look at Gandhi's whole life in multiple books, I think like 4 or 5 books. And it was in one of those books where he mentioned that, what his treatment of women and what he said about African Americans. Well, I guess Africans at that time, what he said. So I'm not sure if it was even brought up to him in that matter, or if somebody, you know, confronted him, or I'm not sure if he made any comments on these.
Yeah, so he never actually got a chance to address these concerns or issues because these were brought up much later after his passing. Um, and as far as the second comment goes, I think, yes, Gandhi has been increasingly scrutinized even in India, even in his own land, for the things that he said and the things that he wrote. So I think the present day India has been increasingly trying to really understand what he was and really understand Gandhi from all perspectives. So I think the present day India, even though has been affected by his writings and the things that he said, he's increasingly being scrutinized. But I think in modern day, he's mostly just being remembered as a person who freed India through the unjust British rule, as well as the person who inspired other great leaders such as Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King Jr. That's what we try to remember him for, and not some of the things that were his drawbacks.
Mm.
Yeah, thank you, Sanat. I think, yeah, and I mean, again, I know I've, you know, done a couple hours of reading, so that's about where I'm at. And, you know, there, in terms of, you know, comments on reflecting on race, I knew that he he volunteered in the Boer War on the side of the Zulus, and became very connected. I don't know if connected is the word, but wrote very affectionately and about that culture. And so there were, you know, in some of his writings, some very pro African cultures as part of those experiences. So there, you know, there is, you know, that's some of the growth in terms of that I've read about in terms of about his racial comments. Um, but I don't know the history nearly as well of kind of his attitudes towards women. We have another question here. We talked about growth, about how did he grow with gender and race? Would he take certain actions later in life? And, you know, Dale, do you know more about kind of how he grew, how he challenged himself? What you know, you talked a lot about that transformation, that evolution of person. Do you have any, you know, and you talked to him in kind of a lot of general terms. Do you have any specifics about how Gandhi reflected on those things, Dale?
Good question. I'm coming to a blank here. I could speak though to his perhaps some points of his sexuality and he seemed to have a distorted, troubled relationship to his own sexuality. And from what I've read, that stems from an experience he had. His father was dying, and on his deathbed, as reported by biographers. And Gandhi left his father's side to have sexual relations with his wife. And during those relations, his father passed away. And from all reports, that experience haunted him. He felt profoundly guilty about that, and that had effect on how he related to his own sexuality. So that, I'm not a psychologist, but that's what it has been reported in the biographies I've read. Also, there is a long tradition in Indian spirituality, the Vedic tradition in particular, about pertaining to celibacy and the importance of celibacy for spiritual enlightenment, spiritual growth. And I think he was very influenced by those teachings and those assumptions in the spiritual tradition of India, the spiritual traditions of India. So he had a complex relationship to his own sexuality, and a troubled one, it seems. And that might have been projected as human beings are ought to do, is to project their internal psychological dynamics onto others, and that might have influenced his views of women at various points in his life. But I'm speculating. I don't have full knowledge of that. But he did work on behalf. Women had a central place in the nonviolent Satyagraha movement towards independence, and he strove later for gender equality, in at least in a political context. Could I ask about censorship? What could my student speak to the issue of censorship if she's willing? I would be interested.
Before we leave that point, there was a comment in the chat that really touched on this, his issues with with women, and to prove his celibacy, he would often sleep naked with young girls, including his own niece, right? So there are these historical actions that he did, and and how do we perceive those, and how do we reflect on those? I think it's important to make those known in terms of how we move forward with this. So thank you for that comment.
And from our perspective, that's troubling, right?
Very, yeah.
A troubling practice.
All right, thank you. And Mysoon, why don't you follow up on Dale's question?
Well, the question was a little bit vague. Is there some specific aspect of censorship that you want me to talk about? I don't know how to approach.
Yes. Well, would you of Gandhi a instance of censorship?
It appears that way to me, but I don't have full knowledge of all of the circumstances that led up to the decision, so I can only speculate. Personally, I don't think it was even a very good sculpture. I don't think that Gandhi would have liked that. Necessarily have wanted a sculpture made of him in that way. I mean, based on the kinds of beliefs he evolved toward. It's a sculpture that's very cliche. It's so hyper realistic, and it just sort of caricaturizes this idea of Gandhi. And it's Gandhi as a peacemaker, as a activist, as opposed to, say, the earlier Gandhi as a lawyer. So this is not me necessarily defending the sculpture itself so much as thinking about how we often respond to issues like this, where the safest or quickest resolution seems to be to just get rid of something or eradicate something. And I'm glad we're having this discussion, because then at least there's a chance to try and find out. Think we've quite gotten to the bottom of exactly how the decision was reached to remove the sculpture. And I'm still a little bit foggy on even the kind of selection process that went into deciding this sculpture would be there to begin with. So I don't know if that answers any of your questions about it, Dale, but I guess I do think it's a little bit censorious.
I just want to say that oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. You can go ahead.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say
Riley.
I kind of thought that about that as well. That he probably wouldn't have liked that. So I'm glad that somebody said it and I wasn't the only one thinking that, because I kind of agree. I mean, like Mother Teresa. I know that there were statues of her taken up, and a lot of people had problems with that because she was Christian, and that's a false god, and that would be against her own religion that she represented, and everybody thought that that she wouldn't have even liked that. So I kind of like that that was talked about, because I wasn't sure if I was the only one that felt that he probably wouldn't have even liked a big statue of himself being erected. But yeah, sorry.
I was also going to say that I worry about censorship, even from an educational point of view, that we should be confronted with points of view that are controversial for us, that challenge our points of view, and even if we profoundly disagree with them, we can that leads to dialogue and the possibility of learning and growth, like we're doing now. So I fear it's clear that the right engages in a lot of censorship, but I worry about censorship on the left, well-intentioned perhaps, but shutting down the possibility of shutting down dialogue and exposure to challenging things.
I'd like to add, maybe build on what you're saying, Dale, by mentioning, while I was preparing for the panel, I learned a little bit about a number of sculpture parks around the world where controversial monuments were removed from their original public spheres and sites and then redistributed in these sort of cloistered areas that were still public but then set off, and then also further contextualized with a lot more information about them. I was really impressed with a few different examples of these spaces because they seem to be dedicated to the idea that it's important not to destroy history, because in a way, by destroying a monument like that, you're almost erasing the kind of flaw that it represented. So allowing that to exist, but then also allowing a discussion to take place around it seems like a good idea. I mean, every single instance of these places, there's one in Taiwan called the Garden of the Generalissimos. There's one in Budapest, Hungary, and a lot of the sculptures had to do with the Soviet occupation of Hungary. There's a really interesting one in Germany where the curator is taking a lot of Nazi sculptures and then putting them in positions that allow visitors to, they're allowing visitors to touch the sculptures, and they're also providing information. I was just intrigued by that idea that in a way, eradicating something doesn't even allow for us to develop a conversation or discussion. And so thinking about how we might reintroduce that sculpture of Gandhi, would it come with the kinds of controversial comments he made, but also talk about the rest of the way his life evolved? Maybe that would be necessary.
Yeah, if I may jump in, I think those are really fascinating there, and ones I've been interested in too, and sort of what do we do? In the case of my research on James Marion Sims and his experimentation on enslaved women, it took probably 10 years at least of community dialogue before that shift occurred. But the question is, it was a removal from the Central Park location, but then the question mark of, and then what, right? And so maybe those kinds of parks that Mysoon is talking about, or, do we put it in a museum? Do we put it in one of those kind of parks? Do we put it next to his gravesite, where he's buried? Those kinds of questions. but in itself, this is a very fascinating question to me, this idea of erasure. Is that a different kind of erasure? Or, does it represent, or, is it a kind of erasure that prevents or prohibits dialogue? Then are there certain statutes that already represent a kind of a erasure in themselves, in the case of Sims and enslaved women? But what this reminds me of is some grad school talks in my memorial culture class, where we talked about, these are sites of memory, and in these sites of memory are always negotiations around meaning making. And that, as we are always remembering, as something is being remembered, either in a statue or what have you, we were asked to also consider what is being forgotten. And that's going to also be the case with Gandhi, or really any statue or dedication. So I think those are really, really fascinating points that Maysoon raises.
So I guess I can talk a little bit more about the process. I mean, Maysoon was question, how do we even pick these sculptures? And then we could talk a little bit more about, maybe the removal process. I wasn't involved in all of those conversations. I didn't even have the conversation with the president. So I can give some insight into that and some of the context they were concerned about. But to start out with, the selection, and again, everybody knows in this audience, I'm not an artist. I enjoy pieces, and so when I come at that selection, we're getting a list of things from a sculpture institute. So in my naive mind, it's these are works of art that we're picking from, right, and that are to be displayed. And so I certainly the way I view these individual pieces is going to change drastically next year, and I value that. So, but I think it's it'll help us, that commission, to question about we have a hodgepodge of tasks on that commission, and the beautification part of it, the sculpture exhibit is just one piece. The other piece is just to make sure there's that we use certain limestone when we build a new building, right? To make sure that there's a certain way that the campus looks, and thinking about the environment in terms of how we deal with water drainage, and whether we mow grass or we plant prairie. So there's a lot of different pieces, and that I think our committee has more expertise in, and those are the expertises I think that were selected for the commission, and that the thoughtfulness about art is, at most, for most of us on that commission, a passing fancy or a hobby. And so I think that that's going to give us some real thought about the process by which we select those pieces going forward. I think the parts about the removal that we really haven't talked about, or that I think were really important, is we talked a lot about the context in which Gandhi said these aspects of these racist statements, but we put up this sculpture of a person in a time when sculptures across the country were being taken down, and on top of that is not one that we did not own, right? Would we have done something differently had it been ours, right? We were renting these pieces, and so I think that changes how does that influence sculpture, or the idea of censorship, when you're again, if I had to make the final decision, I don't know what I would have made, but I think it's very different for me to hide something that I own versus to some degree protecting something that somebody else owns. So I think that was part of that conversation that went higher up, and but yeah, there's a lot. Obviously, the reason we're having this dialogue is there's lots and lots of things that weren't part of that conversation, and that's important. So I guess moving on, I mean, do people want to see the sculpture back on campus? Do people want to have it with with some explanation, or more conversations about, maybe we talk a lot more about it and bring it back in the next round. What are people thinking? What are people seeing in the future?
Been in the chat in the comments too, if you're in the audience. I'm curious. We're doing a poll now, Jonathan. It's the moment of truth. I say keep it. I say keep it with in full consideration of everything. I say keep it with context. Keep it and contextualize it. I think it's important to our. It's important to symbolic representations of peace and social justice, and theoretically standing on the side of the marginalized. I think it says to us that we are all flawed individuals, hopefully capable of change. And I think, as long as we have that important context, maybe even context, like, I don't know what the artist statement said, if that was available, or like some type of placard that could indicate that these were the kinds of dialogues that we were having on campus and making the decisions. But I would say keep it. If we were in that position, recognizing we're not, I would say keep it. And I'm also thinking particularly of our Southeast Asian students, particularly Indian students, and having that kind of symbolic representation for them is important as well. And it's tough. This is a tough one. But I also want to, I'm going to shut up, but I also want to say that it is a false equivalency, in my view, as we're having these dialogues about, slave holders and people who were unequivocally, exploiters, medical exploiters of women, to lump everyone in that category. So we have to have some finessing and nuanced dialogue like we've been having today. So I think that's the opinion I've arrived at.
I agree that there should at least be, I don't have a strong opinion if it stays or goes. That wasn't like my main, point when I initially sent the email. My whole thing was that, again, like, I didn't really know about it. It was news to me. And, I would just hate for something hateful to happen, like, at my home. Like, UT's my home. You know what I mean? I didn't want protests. I didn't want, anyone to misconstrue anything any kind of way. So I was just like, hey, I was very matter of fact in the email. I was like, this is what he said. Did you know that? And I said, I said, I think that there should be more research behind, what kind of statues are put on campus. But I don't, like my Sue said, with the, with the statues that are disbanded or, or removed or whatever, like what you said with the plaque, I think that that's a great idea, that if it would go back on campus, that there's some kind of, maybe stand next to it, kind of talking about it, maybe just being like, because I think it is important that we had this dialogue, because basically this was my goal. Like, I wanted people to talk about it. Yeah. I mean, like, I wanted people to talk about it, and I wanted it to be conversation. And I think that, more people should be involved. I think, that the students should be more involved in what's on campus and stuff like that. And I just thought, that was my initial thing. But I do think that if it would go on campus, that's a great idea to put, like a explanation next to it or something like that. I'm not sure.
I just want to say a few things. I guess to start off, I want to quote Jawaharlal Nehru, who was the first Prime Minister of India, as well as a very dear friend of Mahatma Gandhi. He said to someone else that Gandhi was not a saint. He was a man of many wrongdoings. At the same time, he was a man who did a few things right. And let us remember him for the things that he did right. I guess I remember Gandhi for as a person who showed that transformation is possible, and also an individual who inspired different leaders, not just in India, but throughout the world, Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King Jr., to bring a revolution, to bring a positive change in their communities. There are definitely things that are not very good, but let us remember him for the things that he did right. And just another point that someone said, that as an Indian, when I saw his statue first on the campus during the summer, I was really happy. And I think the role of a sculpture on a campus really is exposure, exposure to a person, exposure to his ideas and different ideologies around the world. So I think it would be just great to see different ideas or different ideology on campus. I think having a placard give more information about him or his work, or the reason why his sculpture is being decided to portray on campus would be really helpful.
Thank you, Sanat. And there was a comment in the chat that that one person here says we should have it back. This is a man who inspired Einstein, inspired MLK, who inspired Mandela. Most of us will never do even a bit of what all these great men did. We should see what they all gave us, then talk about MLK and his moral failures or any negative thing they may have said while they fought society's injustices and they grew to become the giants they are. After that, this is the first time I'm hearing about this. So if there's a way to educate people with the sculpture and a class dialogue. So yeah, I mean, I think hopefully this is the many, first of many conversations about, yeah, from the beginning of what we talked about today, the role of art on campus, to the issue of censorship, to the issue of, how do we celebrate those people that have failings? Important. So other thoughts or comments? We have about 5 or so minutes left, so I want to make sure that especially our panelists have anything they last want to contribute, or make sure we have time. Keep sending stuff in the chat, and I will. So if the attendees have any further comments as well, I want to make sure people get those in before we finish up.
I want to add to or respond to Rachel's comment about negative erasure, and just agree that that is definitely an issue that creates even more complexity around these kinds of decisions. So I didn't want to leave any implication that I'm somehow trying to defend the right for these Confederate statues to exist, so much as making sure there was a time period, especially in the early 1900s, when communities were really forcefully trying to put those statues up and doing so with prejudice, and that decision making doesn't get lost in history. So by holding on to those monuments, maybe we allow for that reckoning to take place.
Right. Yeah, I think that's what I heard you saying. Yeah, that's what I heard you saying, for sure. We were asked in that graduate seminar, in each kind of site of cultural memory, we were asked to say, what is being remembered here? What is being forgotten here? And who's doing the remembering and recalling? And I found those questions, so simple. They really raise so many issues as we, have these dialogues, these ongoing conversations, and as we really look at art, in this sense, sculptures, as a kind of representation and as a site of memory, and as a space for contestation and meaning making.
I would add that I think we've gone back to Maysoon's point about power and the display of power and ideology. So, which also connects to memory. I think I just wanted to bring us to that very important point.
And I'll just make one suggestion to the committee that you do bring students into the composition of it
Yes.
for future. Yeah.
Yep.
That was my point as well. I mean, because I feel like from a very pretty biased standpoint, because I am a student. Students aren't involved in anything on campus. You know what I mean? They're not. Everything is changing around us, and especially they make UT makes their own decisions, and especially things with COVID and everything that's going on. It's the little stuff that students could be involved in that could make them feel like they're heard or that they're more represented or that they're more involved in the politics of running a campus, which I don't have any knowledge of that. I'm sure it's very complicated, but just in general, just to kind of share that light and kind of humanize UT, because I mean, like I said earlier, this is my home, so this was my main goal, so I'm very honored to be involved in this in general.
Yeah, well, and I mean to that, I teach intro courses, and if I tell students if they reach the right ear, students have a lot more power than faculty. I guess the other faculty are nodding their heads at because especially the right administrators and the right faculty realize that part of an education is to empower students to make change, and you only have 4 years to do that. They know our faculty will be here forever, so they can push us off as much as they want. But the students really do have a voice. It's really important for us to find the avenues for them to have those voices and to have them plugged in. And so yeah, we do plan on on having student on the commission, and I personally look for ways to engage students as often as possible. So any other, we got 2 minutes left. I don't want to go past any time barriers, but I'll finish by saying, as long as there doesn't come up in the chat yet, I truly value everybody that served on the panel tonight. I have learned an amazing amount in the past month or so, and especially tonight. And I want to thank you all for your very thoughtful comments. We were able to have a conversation where there was some disagreements. We found common ground, and really appreciate all the thought and heart that went into all you said. So thank you very much, panel. With that, go ahead, Dan.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
It was enlightening.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, everybody. And Dr. McKether also in the comments there says, thank you all, great conversation. Pleasure. I especially want to say to Riley and Sanat, very proud of you. And this will be a big part of your college memories too, that you took such a stand and had such an important voice and made this happen in some way. So congrats to you too.
Hear, hear.
So much. It was a great pleasure just being here tonight. It was a big learning curve leading up to this conversation, and especially tonight as well. A lot of great perspectives and a lot of good knowledge about the situation. So thank you, everyone.
All right, my clock says 7 o'clock. Thank you all very, very much. I appreciate it. Look forward to interacting with all of you in the future. Have a good night.
Bye, everybody. Take care.